Right, let's have a look at glycolysis. Glycolysis is the start of respiration, and it occurs only in the cytoplasm, and it acts upon glucose. Now we're going to represent glucose just with 6C for the 6 carbons. Remember, this only occurs in the cytoplasm. Now the first step is the phosphorylation, going from ATP to ADP, and the phosphate gets added onto the glucose to produce glucose phosphate. Now that process occurs twice. So the ATP again gets turned into ADP, diphosphate, and it phosphorylates it. And here. Now this bit is very important because this gives the molecule the energy to split. So this molecule here is known as hexose. Hex is 6, O's is sugar, bi, as in 2, phosphate. So hexose biphosphate. This then splits to give you 2 molecules of tri-O's, that means it's a sugar, phosphate. Now this part is known as the glycolytic step, and lytic is a word that comes from lysis, which means to split, so this is glycolytic step, which is where the hexose biphosphate splits to give you 2 3-carbon triose phosphate molecules. Now what happens after that is that each of these molecules, the same thing happens to it. Now this involves ADP picking up this phosphate and being turned into ATP. Again to form ATP. Now this is substrate level phosphorylation, which is the direct phosphorylation of an ADP to an ATP. So it doesn't involve the inner mitochondrial membrane, it doesn't involve oxygen. Now, whilst that's being done, there is an oxidation step, and the electron is picked up by a carrier molecule, and the carrier molecule is NAD. And this picks up an electron and a hydrogen to form NADH. Now, this, of course, happens twice because there are 2 molecules of triose phosphate, so there are 2 molecules of reduced NAD. Also, at the same time, sufficient energy is released to phosphorylate another ADP with a phosphate to form ATP. And this is a phosphate which is just lying around in the cytoplasm. And so we then end up producing 2 molecules of 3-carbon, and this is pyruvate. Now, this process starts with the glucose. You phosphorylate it twice, you produce a hexose biphosphate, you have the glycolytic step, and you produce 2 molecules of 3-carbon triose phosphate. Remember, that phosphate is then attached to an ADP to form an ATP. At the same time, this is an oxidation step, the electron is transferred onto the NAD to form NADH, and then sufficient energy is also released to produce another 2 ATPs. These ATPs are produced, again, I must emphasize, through substrate level phosphorylation. So what we've produced so far is we've produced 2 NADHs, 2 reduced NADHs, we've produced 4 ATPs, but we've consumed 2, so there's a net production here of 2 ATPs. And we've produced 2 pyruvate molecules. Now this process will continue as long as you have glucose going in, and as long as you have NADs which are able to pick up the electrons at this step. This process will continue. The problem comes is that these NADs are being used and being reduced to form NADHs. So in order for it to continue, you must have more NADs being produced. Now, you can produce those NADs in two ways. Either the NADs can go off to aerobic respiration, so these can go off, if it's a eukaryote, to the inner mitochondrial membrane, where they're going to deliver the electrons and it's going to regenerate the NAD, and eventually the electrons are going to join with oxygen to produce, and hydrogens to produce water. And the flow, does oxidative phosphorylation, produces lots of ATP, and that's aerobic respiration. Now, if you haven't got any oxygen, the alternate plan is to take these NADHs and put the electrons onto the pyruvate and turn it in bacteria and in humans into lactic acid. Now, this process doesn't consume any oxygen, doesn't produce any carbon dioxide, and this process is anaerobic respiration. The pyruvate gets turned into lactic acid and we regenerate the NADs. So this process can continue as long as we're able to tolerate the buildup of lactic acid. In plants, there's a slightly different mechanism. So in plants and yeast, again, we've got anaerobic respiration, and this involves taking the NADH, sticking the electron onto the pyruvate, and via ethanol, it produces ethanol. This also produces carbon dioxide. So when you think of anaerobic respiration, don't think of it as being an entirely separate process from respiration. Anaerobic respiration is just glycolysis with a different way of getting rid of the reduced NAD and converting it back into NAD. So if you have oxygen, the NADs go off to the inner mitochondrial membrane or the inside of the bacterial membrane and go through aerobic respiration and end up producing water. If you don't have oxygen, then it goes onto the pyruvate to produce lactic acid in bacteria and in us, in eukaryotes, well, not all eukaryotes, whereas in yeast and in plants, it goes off to produce ethanol with the production of carbon dioxide. And that's glycolysis. And that is a very confusing diagram. Anyway, I hope it helps.